I was 16 the night my father told me to leave. It was mid-October, the air biting and cold. The argument started over something so trivial I can't even remember it anymore. Maybe I forgot to take out the trash, or perhaps I said something sarcastic at the wrong time. But like always, it spiraled. My father's face turned crimson. His voice thundered through the house, and my mother stood silently in the corner, staring at her shoes. "Get out, Ryan," my father barked, pointing to the door. I hesitated, glancing at my mom, desperate for a sign. Any sign that this wasn't real, that she would intervene. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. Her silence was deafening. My chest tightened as the realization sank in. I turned, climbed the stairs, and stuffed whatever clothes I could grab into my backpack. When I walked out the front door, the porch light flicked off behind me. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be utterly alone. My only sanctuary was an old, faded blue Chevy Astro van with a cracked windshield and seats that carried a faint mildew scent. It wasn't much, but it started when I turned the key. At that moment, it was everything I had. That night, I parked behind a Walmart, wrapped myself in a hoodie, and stared at the van's ceiling, waiting for my phone to buzz, for someone to call, for the front door to open and someone to tell me to come back home. But no one did. The first weeks were the hardest. I had about $40 in cash, and whatever loose change was rattling around the bottom of the van. I rationed cheap fast food, trying to stretch it as far as possible. Gas became more valuable than food. If I couldn't move my van, I couldn't sleep safely. I learned that parking lots behind big stores like Walmart and Target were the safest bets. Security guards didn't care as long as you kept things tidy, and there were usually other cars parked overnight. Other people like me trying to vanish. The van became my entire world. The back row of seats folded down into a makeshift bed, though the metal bars underneath jabbed into my back no matter how many blankets I piled on. I hung an old towel across the rear windows for privacy. My backpack stayed tucked under the passenger seat, ready to grab if I had to leave in a hurry. Each day I searched for work. Without a high school diploma, most places wouldn't even give me a second glance. After weeks of rejection, I finally landed a job at a greasy little diner, washing dishes under the table for cash. The manager, Donna, had nicotine-stained fingers and eyes that seemed perpetually tired. She didn't ask questions when I said I didn't have an address. "Show up on time, don't steal, and don't piss off the cooks," she told me. I worked grueling 14-hour shifts, scrubbing plates until my knuckles bled from the industrial soap and scalding water. When the diner closed at 2 a.m., I'd drive back to my usual parking spot, lock the doors, and sleep until the sun turned the van into an unbearable oven. Winter was the worst. Some nights, I couldn't feel my fingers or toes. I'd sit curled up in the driver's seat, knees pressed to my chest, trying to breathe warmth into my cupped hands. I layered every piece of clothing I owned, but it was never enough. Occasionally, I'd drive just to let the heater run for a few precious minutes, though I couldn't afford the gas. Showers came from a YMCA membership I scraped together the funds for. Clothes were washed in public restroom sinks and dried under hand dryers. I learned which gas stations didn't mind if you lingered while charging your phone at an outlet near the soda machines. Over time, I mastered the art of invisibility. People don't notice you if you keep your head down, avoid eye contact, and stay quiet. You become just another shadow in the background. But invisibility is a double-edged sword. Sometimes, drunks would knock on my van windows late at night, looking for trouble. Once, someone tried to open the passenger door while I was asleep. After that, I kept a tire iron under my seat. I met others like me, wandering souls moving from one parking lot to another. Charlie, an older man who'd been living on the streets for nearly a decade, taught me tricks, like how to keep condensation from freezing on the inside of the windows. Most people, though, were fleeting. They'd vanish one day, and I'd never see them again. By the time I turned 18, I'd saved just enough to rent a tiny room in the back of a mechanic's shop. The walls were thin, and the place perpetually smelled of oil and burnt rubber. But it was warm. I could lock the door behind me. I picked up extra shifts at a gas station, juggling 2 jobs and working nearly 70 hours a week. My body ached and my eyes burned with exhaustion, but I was surviving. 3 years later, I'd saved enough for a down payment on a foreclosed house. It was barely more than a glorified shed, with a leaky roof and warped floorboards, but the day I signed the papers, I sat in the empty living room and cried. It was mine. No one could kick me out ever again. I spent the next year fixing it up, watching YouTube tutorials on plumbing, drywall, and electrical work. Slowly, the house became livable. Furniture was sparse, a thrifted couch, a mattress on the floor, and a wobbly dining table. But it was enough. Then one Tuesday afternoon there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, my stomach clenched. My mother stood there, clutching her purse like a shield. My father stood behind her, arms crossed, his face unreadable. And peeking out from under a hoodie was Lucas, my little brother, except he wasn't so little anymore. He was 16, the same age I'd been when I was thrown out. "Ryan," my mother said softly, "can we come in?" Every instinct screamed to slam the door, but then Lucas looked at me, his eyes wide, unsure, pleading. I stepped aside. They entered my home like they belonged there, glancing around and nodding approvingly. My dad walked straight into the kitchen and opened the fridge without asking. My mom sank into the couch with a sigh, as if finally relaxing after a long day. Lucas lingered by the door, his hands buried in his hoodie pockets, eyes darting nervously between me and our parents. It didn't take long for them to explain. They'd lost the house. Money was tight. They needed somewhere to stay. Just for a while, they said, until they could get back on their feet. I stared at them, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. After all these years, after everything, now they needed my help. But then I saw Lucas again. His face was pale, his jaw tight, tension radiating off him. My chest ached. 2 weeks, I said finally, my voice firm. That's all. But deep down I wasn't so sure. For the first few days, I tried convincing myself that this arrangement might actually work. My parents stayed in the guest room, a small space I had finished painting just 2 months ago, while Lucas took the couch in the living room. I set clear boundaries right from the start. 2 weeks, no exceptions. But boundaries only work when people respect them, and my family had never been good at that. First, it was the small things. My dad left his dirty coffee mug on the kitchen counter every morning, despite the sink being only a step away. My mom took it upon herself to rearrange the pantry because, as she said, it makes more sense this way. And though Aunt Karen wasn't physically there, her passive-aggressive texts arrived daily, dripping with fake concern. "Hope you're not too overwhelmed with everyone there. Family is a lot of work, huh?" Lucas, though, was different. He moved quietly, careful not to take up too much space. Every morning, he folded the blanket he slept with and neatly arranged the couch pillows. He offered to help with dishes, yard work, or anything else he thought might lighten my load. One night, about a week in, I found him sitting on the back porch. His hoodie was pulled up, knees drawn to his chest, the pale glow of the moon outlining his silhouette. I stepped out and sat beside him. "Everything okay?" he asked. He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the overgrown yard. "They're fighting again," he sighed. I'd heard it too, the muffled arguments seeping through the thin walls of the guest room. "Is that normal for them now?" I asked hesitantly. Lucas gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Yeah, pretty much. Every day. Sometimes it's about money, sometimes it's about nothing at all. Dad's angry all the time now. Mom just cries. And then Aunt Karen stirs it all up again." We sat in silence for a while, the chill of the night air settling around us like a heavy blanket. "You know," Lucas said softly, "they told me you ran away. That you left because you didn't want to deal with them anymore." My stomach tightened. "That's not what happened," I said quietly. "I know," he replied. "I figured it out eventually. Aunt Karen let it slip during one of her wine rants last year." I clenched my jaw, anger bubbling under the surface. They'd lied to him, painted me as the villain. And Lucas, this quiet, thoughtful kid who deserved so much better, had been caught in the middle of their mess. "You don't have to stay with them, Lucas," I said after a moment. When the 2 weeks are up, you can stay here. You don't have to go back. He hesitated, his fingers twisting nervously in the hem of his hoodie. I don't know if I can do that. I mean, they're still my parents, you know. He nodded. I understood exactly what he meant. But things didn't get better. They got worse. On the 10th day, I came home from work to find my dad sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of my mail spread out in front of him. Bills, bank statements, personal documents he had no business looking at. What the hell are you doing? I snapped, dropping my keys onto the counter. Relax, he said, leaning back in the chair. Just making sure you're staying on top of things. Wouldn't want you to lose the house after all. Something inside me snapped. You don't get to act like you care whether I lose this house or not. You threw me out. And now you're sitting here, going through my mail, drinking my coffee, and acting like you have any kind of authority over me. His face darkened. My father had never been the kind of man who took well to being challenged. I could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Don't raise your voice at me, Ryan, he said, his tone low and dangerous. But I wasn't 16 anymore. I wasn't some scared kid desperate for his approval or terrified of his temper. This is my house, I said firmly. You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to treat me like a child in my own home. My mom appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands in that nervous way she always did when conflict bubbled up. Please, both of you, she said softly. Let's not fight. Ryan, your father didn't mean anything by it. He's just trying to help. Help? I laughed bitterly. Help looks a lot different than going through someone's private mail and criticizing everything they've worked for. My dad pushed back from the table and stood, towering over me. You know what? Maybe we should leave. Maybe we're wasting our time trying to fix things with you. Maybe you should, I said coldly. My mom gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Ryan, please don't say that. But I was done. I was so damn tired of tiptoeing around them in my own home. 2 weeks, I said, my voice shaking slightly. That's what we agreed on. You've got 4 days left. After that, I want you out. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing in stunned silence. That night, I lay in my room staring at the ceiling. I could hear the faint murmur of my mother's voice through the walls, trembling as she tried to calm my father down. Part of me felt guilty, like I'd failed some unspoken duty as their son. But a bigger part of me was furious. Furious at their entitlement, their lack of accountability, their inability to see me as anything other than the rebellious teenager they'd kicked out years ago. The next morning, Lucas knocked softly on my bedroom door. Can I come in? Yeah, of course. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. His hoodie pulled low over his face. Even so, I could see the worry in his eyes. They're not going to leave, Ryan, he said quietly. They're already talking about how they can convince you to let them stay longer. Aunt Karen's supposed to come next week. Mom said something about asking you to let her move in too. My stomach turned. Aunt Karen in my house? Well, absolutely not. I don't know what to do, Lucas, I admitted. I can't let them stay, but kicking them out feels, I don't know, wrong, I guess. He sat down on the edge of my bed, his shoulders slumping. You've done more for them than they ever did for you. Don't let them guilt you into thinking otherwise. Lucas was only 16, but in that moment, he sounded so much older, like someone who had been carrying the weight of our family for far too long. When they leave, you can stay here, I said. You don't have to go with them. I want to stay, he said softly. But I'm scared of what'll happen if I do. Mom's going to cry. Dad's going to get mad. And Aunt Karen, he trailed off, shaking his head. You're not responsible for their feelings, I said gently. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be happy. He nodded, but I could see how the weight of the decision was crushing him. The final days were tense. My dad barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were short and clipped. My mom floated around the house like a ghost, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Lucas stayed in the guest room most of the time, headphones on, ignoring the missed calls lighting up his phone. On the last night, just before midnight, my dad came into the living room where I was scrolling on my phone. He sat down across from me, his expression cold and determined. "We've decided," he said flatly. "We're not leaving." The tension in the air was suffocating as my father planted himself in the chair across from me. His face, as hard as stone, betrayed no sign of compromise. "We've decided we're not leaving," he said flatly. I looked up from my phone, the weight of his words settling in my chest like a boulder. My stomach churned, but I kept my voice steady. "That's not your decision to make." He scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "We don't have anywhere else to go, Ryan. You have this whole house to yourself. Don't you think it's selfish to let your own family struggle when you could help?" The sheer audacity of his argument sent a jolt of anger through me. I set my phone down, meeting his gaze head-on. "No," I said firmly. "You had your chance, years to make things right with me. But you didn't. You threw me out, and now you expect me to save you. You don't get to do that." His face contorted with fury, and his voice dropped to a venomous sneer. "You think you're better than us now, don't you? Because you own this little house and work your dead-end jobs. You think that makes you a man." I rose to my feet, my hands trembling as I fought to contain the anger boiling inside me. "Get out," I said through clenched teeth. "Get out of my house and don't come back." The sound of his chair scraping against the floor echoed through the room as he stood, his towering frame casting a shadow that once would have made me shrink. My mother appeared in the doorway then, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her hands to her chest. "Please, Ryan," she whispered. "Don't do this." Behind her, Lucas stood frozen, his wide eyes darting between us. But I didn't waver. "You have to leave," I repeated, my voice low but unyielding. "All of you. Now." For a moment, my father looked as though he might lash out, but instead, he turned sharply and stormed out the door. My mother hesitated, her lips quivering as if to say something, but she eventually followed him, leaving a trail of silence in her wake. Lucas remained rooted in the hallway, his backpack slung over one shoulder. I turned to him, my voice softening. "Are you going with them?" His eyes dropped to the floor. "I can't," he said, his voice cracking. I can't do it anymore." I stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to," I said, and for the first time in days, his face relaxed just a little. The door slammed shut behind my parents, leaving the house eerily quiet. Lucas and I stood in the dim light of the hallway, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on us both. But as the silence stretched on, a strange feeling began to settle over me. Relief. That first night without them was suffocating in its stillness. Lucas sat curled up on the far end of the couch, gripping his phone like a lifeline. His backpack, still zipped tightly, sat on the floor beside him, as though he weren't sure if he could truly unpack. "You don't have to sleep on the couch," I said quietly. "You can take the guest room." He hesitated, searching my face for confirmation. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "It's yours now." A small, tentative smile broke across his face as he rose and shuffled toward the hallway, dragging his backpack behind him. I stayed on the couch long after he left, staring at the blank television screen, the magnitude of everything that had just happened pressing down on me. When I finally climbed into bed, sleep was elusive. My mind buzzed with memories, regrets, and the sting of guilt, but beneath it all, a quiet sense of resolution. In the days that followed, Lucas tread lightly, as though he were still a guest overstaying his welcome. He asked permission to use the shower, to grab food from the fridge, to sit on the couch while I worked at the dining table. But slowly, those barriers began to dissolve. I helped him enroll at the local high school, and when the counselor asked for an emergency contact, Lucas glanced at me with wide, uncertain eyes. "Put me down," I said without hesitation. The look on his face, a mix of shock and gratitude, stayed with me for weeks. The first time I heard him laugh was a Saturday morning, when we were attempting to fix a crooked cabinet door in the kitchen. I had been holding the screwdriver all wrong, muttering curses under my breath, when the entire door popped off and nearly smacked me in the face. Lucas burst into laughter, the sound full and unguarded, a bright contrast to the heavy silences of our past. It was the best sound I'd heard in years. Not every moment was easy. Some nights, I heard muffled sobs coming from the guest room. Other times, he flinched at loud voices on TV, shadows of old fears still lingering. He didn't talk much about our parents, and I didn't push him to. When he did, it was in brief, halting sentences. One evening, as we sat eating mac and cheese and chicken nuggets, he asked, "Do you think they regret it? What they did to you? To us?" I set my fork down, leaning back in my chair. "I don't know, Lucas. I'd like to think they do, but I'm not sure they even understand what they did wrong." He nodded slowly. "I think Mom does. But Dad?" His voice trailed off and he shook his head. We didn't talk about it again, but the weight of it lingered between us. Months turned into a year. Lucas graduated high school, and I was there in the audience, cheering him on and taking blurry photos. We celebrated afterward with greasy burgers, where he told me he'd decided to enroll in the local community college. "If that's okay," he added hesitantly. "It's more than okay," I said. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples, we sat on the porch together. Lucas stared out at the fading light. "You saved my life," he said softly. I shook my head. "No, Lucas. You saved your own life. You made the choice to walk away." "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I wouldn't have had anywhere to go if it weren't for you." I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat there beside him, letting the quiet stretch between us. Family isn't about blood or obligation. It's not about guilt or the people who happen to share your last name. It's about showing up. It's about being there when someone has nowhere else to turn. Lucas is my family, and as we move forward, I know one thing for certain. Neither of us will ever feel that crushing loneliness again.